regardless of the fact that I had the top job in Scotland, the first thing that some people will see of me, it's not that I'm First Minister of Scotland, but that I'm a brown person, or that I'm a Muslim.
Taking centre stage today is Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland, who made history as the first Muslim to lead a Western country. With over a decade in government as a member of the Scottish National Party, Yousaf has tackled institutional racism while also being outspoken about the genocide in Gaza. Humza Yousaf talks about the challenges of being an ethnic minority leader in an often hostile political climate, the rise of the far right in Europe, and how 5 countries holding a veto at the United Nations Security Council ought to be considered a relic of the past. Humza Yousaf, thank you very much for joining us on Centre Stage. I want to start by talking a little bit about your background, your upbringing, how that shaped a career path that led to the top job in Scottish politics and one of the most senior jobs in the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to join you on Centre Stage. To be honest, my life, in some respects, as a young boy who was the son of an immigrant, was pretty typical of the son of a South Asian immigrant. I had a wonderful childhood. Although my name sounded different, I looked different to many of my peers, I didn't really view myself as much different. I was Scottish to the core, supported and still support my local football team in Glasgow Celtic, talked about football, played football, and then suddenly everything really changed at 16 years old when 9/11 took place. And not just for me, I know many Muslims across the world, and particularly in Europe and the United States, suddenly you were very aware of being different. People, I will never forget that 9/11 took place on a Tuesday. I went into school on the Wednesday morning, age 16, watched the same news coverage as my peers did. Of course, an absolute shock and horror at what happened. And the 2 people who were my friends that I used to sit beside every morning in registration class, I don't think with any maliciousness, but started bombarding me with questions around, why do Muslims hate America? Do you know who did it? Why did they do it? And as a 16-year-old boy who used to just talk football and all the normal things that 16-year-old boys do with their friends, I suddenly was so aware that actually, I'm not quite the same as everybody else. And we used to, as children, never sit around when Dad was going to watch the news at 7 o'clock. We'd leave the room and go do something else. But at that point, I decided to watch, and I became instantly hooked about wanting to know what was going on in the world around me. And I remember a few years later, my dad saying, do you know what? See, instead of moaning at the television and being angry at what's going on, why don't you go do something about it? And alhamdulillah, I decided to do it.
And that was getting involved in politics?
More so that I wanted to be involved in the background, I must confess. First, frontline politics actually never really particularly appealed to me. But I went to study politics. I was thinking of studying law, but decided to study politics.
But now there was the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, the anti-war movement, the protests.
Yeah, and I was part of the anti-war movement. We blocked off one of the main junctions in Glasgow, and we organised a protest. And it was actually a protest in London where I became converted to the cause of independence, Scottish independence. I was walking past the House of Commons, and it just dawned on me thinking, why is it that Scottish sons and daughters are being sent to a war that we disagree with? All the polling at the time was showing that Scotland disagreed vehemently with the war in Iraq. Our sons and daughters not just sent there, but I'm afraid some of them coming back in body bags. Why are they being sent there? And why is the government 400 miles away in London making that decision for us? And that was, to be honest, the trigger or the penny dropping moment for me that converted me to the cause of independence.
There's always a difference that people can, it's almost tangible between Scottish politics and politics of Westminster. You find that there is a more or a kinder politics when it comes to international relations in Scotland than you do in England. Do you think that there's a bit of a difference between kind of like the way Scotland and the Scottish people view the world and the way the rest of the United Kingdom does? And if indeed you do kind of subscribe to that idea, why do you think that there hasn't been more success to try and maybe detach Scotland, or at least, if not through the failure of the independence referendum, to impact how Westminster does politics with particularly this part of the world, but also internationally?
Yeah. Let me say, I agree with the analysis that politics in Scotland, particularly when it comes to global affairs, external affairs, we do have a different approach often to the Westminster government. And by the way, I should say that is not just for the SNP and where the SNP is concerned. When Labour were in an administration before my party, I think even they had sometimes a different of approach to issues such as, for example, migration and so on and so forth. So there is that difference. The question and the impact is challenging because, I was going to say whether I like it or not, I don't like the fact that we're still part of the United Kingdom. That's my political view. But whether people agree with it or disagree with it, the reality is foreign affairs is reserved to the United Kingdom government in London. Now, we can try to do some outreach. We have some offices across the world where we try to do that. We try to make alliances where we can. But ultimately, if you don't sit round the table as an independent sovereign member of the United Nations, you don't have that sovereignty where you can take cases in the way that South Africa has to the International Court of Justice, then actually your sphere of influence is curtailed and restrained. And this is why Scottish independence for me is of course linked ostensibly to domestic issues around control of your economy and control of your fiscal and monetary levers, but also it's very much intertwined with being a good global citizen in the world, much like, for example, our close neighbours, Ireland and Norway, who I think make a really positive impact on the global stage.
On that, Gaza, actually, indeed Scotland's position, but particularly your voice was heard, let's say, beyond the normal audiences that a Scottish First Minister would be heard on international relations, with the case of your in-laws being stuck in Gaza when the genocidal war began there. You were one of the first people in office to call for a ceasefire in the Western world.
So ultimately, you ask my feelings, and I find it hard myself to find the words. It's not frustration, that's too weak a word. It's not even, it's beyond anger at the fact that we are more than a year in, more than 14 months. And what makes this situation horrendous is not just the numbers. The numbers are awful, awful. And we don't even have the true scale of the numbers. You know, we don't know the bodies under the rubble. What makes this situation worse than anything that I've witnessed in my lifetime, and I've witnessed Rwanda, and we've seen Bosnia in our lifetimes, it is the fact that so much of the brutality, in fact, most of the brutality, is being live streamed into our living rooms and on our mobile phones. And so much of the world is either silent or, even worse, in the case of, for example, the United Kingdom government, complicit by selling arms to a government whose head has an ICC arrest warrant for war crimes issued against him. So I feel like I'm going mad. I wonder whether the rest of the world is seeing what we're seeing.
So this idea of people wondering, is it us that's going mad or not? I mean, from a journalist perspective, almost 200 journalists being killed in Gaza, the highest number of journalists being killed in any conflict ever. Looking at the fact that the UK has had weekly protests against the genocide in Gaza, yet the government continues to take its stance in supporting ultimately that genocide. That if the distance between the people, between the streets and the politicians and the political system, if that continues to grow, that will translate into not frustration amongst people, not just anger amongst people, but it would lead them to other things. The idea when you have no peaceful route to express yourself, is there no concern of the consequences of this in the long term?
I suppose the answer to that is clearly not. Otherwise, they would have acted by now. I mean, I can't speak for the UK government, but let's just address a couple of these issues. Let's be absolutely clear that the reason we are seeing a difference of treatment of the people of Gaza and, for example, the people of Ukraine. By the way, I absolutely support the UK's actions and solidarity with Ukraine. The reason for the difference in treatment. But let's just say if there was 45,000 blue-eyed, blonde-haired Europeans that were being killed, this ceasefire would have materialised months ago. It is just racism. And we should just call it a spade a spade. The difficulty is that it's so blatant, it's so open, it's no longer just subtly institutionalised. You've got at least 25 million Muslims in Europe. The anger and frustration that they're feeling at the double standard and hypocrisy of their own governments, they are European Muslims, is going to cause long-term division, and as you say, is just the ammunition that extremists need in order to create their propaganda. And that, to me, deeply worries me. And that's true in Europe. If I think about the atrocities and war crimes committed by Israel, as somebody who believes in a two-state solution, who believes in Israel coexisting alongside a Palestinian state, you tell me, how does killing a father's children and wife, how does that make you any safer? I'm a father of 3 girls. If you kill my children, trust me, I've got nothing to live for except getting revenge. So it neither makes the region safer, and it certainly doesn't make the rest of the world safer. And it is rooted absolutely in racism. Let's call it what it is.
Some would say that the international and national political institutions are so institutionally racist that there's no point in somebody like Humza Yousaf or any of the other kind of ethnic minority MPs and politicians engaging in the system. You need to bring that system down and start again. And others would say, actually, were it not for the involvement of those ethnic minorities, then maybe that kind of clarity and expose of the kind of illnesses that exist within these institutions wouldn't have happened. You've been in power or in office for a period of time. Do you feel that actually there is space to enforce positive change? Honestly, I understand you're still part of the party and so forth, but really, is it worth it?
Let me be absolutely clear. I absolutely think if you're a Muslim anywhere in the world, you should engage in your communities and in your political structure because it's the way that you can make change. But hand on heart, I absolutely believe that. Because if I had not engaged, if I wasn't involved, and I'm not just talking about being First Minister, people rightly concentrate on that. I was lucky to be in government for 12 years and being able to influence policy as a government minister in the inner circle for 12 years. And if I wasn't there, and you talked about the fact earlier on that my voice on Gaza was heard across the world, if I was just Humza Yousaf keyboard warrior on X and Instagram, okay, I might have had some reach, but nowhere near the influence or the reach that I had. In terms of my own circumstances demitting office, look, of course I had a backlash around Gaza, but look, the reasons I left office were just the functionalities and the realities of leading a minority party and government, and nothing really to do with these issues. But let me just tell you why I think you have to be involved. Firstly, multilateral reform of our multilateral institutions is vital. The Security Council, obsolete, anachronistic, set in the past, completely unfair that these 5 countries have a veto on the rest of the world. And almost nobody disagrees with that statement anymore that is reasonably minded. So there has to be reform of our multilateral institutions, no ifs, no buts. But you have to get yourself involved. By the way, it doesn't mean things get resolved overnight. Even if you have me and Sadiq Khan and all these other Muslims that might be involved in politics in the United Kingdom or across Europe, what you can do, though, is begin to affect that change. If you're not in the system, not involved, not working, not being active, then you have no way of changing or affecting the system in a democratic way.
We have a second Trump administration. How do you envisage this second administration coming, particularly again, like I say, we're at a time where the world is, in a lot worse a situation than it was back during that first presidency.
Yeah. So I'm probably going to say something that may sound counterintuitive, given my politics are well known of the centre left and progressive politics. But I think he has to be given a chance. He won the vote, got the mandate. Don't agree with many of his policies, but I also saw what the Democrats did when they were in power over the course of the last, well, not 4 years, but also, of course, particularly in the last 14 months. And Donald Trump is somebody who clearly likes to get deals done and take the credit for it. We need an end to conflict and war. The question will always be, though, at what price? And if I just take the situation, I take two situations, both in Gaza and if I take Ukraine, Ukraine must have its sovereignty and intact and territorial sovereignty protected. And the same must be true for Palestine, is that it cannot be expected in any ceasefire deal to compromise its territory. Gaza must remain with the people of Gaza. So, look, I've got some fears, of course I do, because of some of the rhetoric, some of the past action. But what has upset me greatly about Western governments, and of course we've seen this with the United States, is I think we are probably at the most critical juncture for international law that the world has ever seen. Either international law has to apply equally, or it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Well, we heard from Lindsey Graham when he was talking about the ICC, he said it wasn't made for us.
Yeah, which is an astonishing thing to say. Can you imagine in domestic law, you said, the law on theft doesn't apply to us, applies to everybody else, but doesn't apply to us. So the fact that you've got an international criminal court and people like Graham and many other congressmen and women saying that we should now sanction, just think about it for a minute, sanction the International Criminal Court. But then you've also got European governments who are saying, well, maybe we won't comply with the terms of the arrest warrant. Actually, Netanyahu won't be arrested. But wait a minute, when aggressions were being committed against Europeans in Ukraine, you said Vladimir Putin would be arrested, which I agree with. But it doesn't apply to your allies. So it goes back to this point that the racism is so blatant that we're at this tipping point here where either international law is worth something, is the rules-based order by which we all play, by which governs us, it's the parameters which determine our actions, or it's completely worthless, and therefore the incentive to peace, which is deterrence around accountability, either that remains intact, but it is very much at the tipping point.
Over the past 10 years, ultimately, we've seen a huge disenchantment across the world, really, from the status quo that exists in terms of how politics is done, in terms of a disenchantment between, as I say, the average person in the street and those in power. Has there ever been discussions that you've been privy to how to remain relevant, quite frankly, to a new generation of people that are coming that genuinely don't kin any respect, quite frankly, to world leaders? We've seen it, for example, in the media, from a news reporting perspective, where you've had to adapt and change and become a lot more relevant to people by using different means and so forth. Marketing companies see it and football clubs do it. Everybody has done something different to remain relevant and close to new generations and to win over their trusts again and so forth. Except politicians.
Yeah. Well, except I think the right type of politician, and I'll come back to what I mean by that, because some political movements are thriving. Those on the far right and populism. And populism by its nature, of course, is presenting very simple solutions to very complex problems. Where you're absolutely correct is, again, for those who are progressive, like I am, what we've miserably failed to do, and I've got to hold my hands up to where I failed in this, what we failed to do is present what is the hopeful alternative to the far right. So the far right will use pithy slogans, very simple solutions to very complex problems, They'll tell you it's the migrants' fault, it's the Muslims' fault, that's why you don't have a job, that's why you don't have that nice house that you've got. All of this false narrative. And what we've done is anybody who sympathises with that, we've just called them a bunch of racist, fascist, far-right neo-Nazis. But actually, that's not what most of the people who support or vote for these movements are. They're disenfranchised because their living standards in Europe, for example, in the United Kingdom have fallen, but yet at the same time they see enormous wealth, sometimes from politicians or those further in business or extremely wealthy individuals. And what the left and those who are progressive, as I say, have failed to do, and take the US elections as a classic example, they failed to articulate what they stood for, where the hope was. And that's where politicians in Europe really have to get working, because right across Europe, the rise of the far right, driven by anti-Muslim hatred, I have to say, is increasing at an exponential rate.
There are now in UK politics, not just actually in UK politics, in Western politics, maybe the highest number of Muslim politicians in history. But they've always been the ones that have had the microscope on them, that have had their loyalty questioned. We've seen, for example, people like Rashida Tlaib in the US having her loyalty questioned when there have been actual members of Congress who have spoken about wanting to serve in the Israeli military. This level of Islamophobia, you reach the literal top job in the country and someone's still questioning you. How does that make you feel?
It was really hurtful. It was hard. It was difficult. But at the same time, you ended up getting desensitized to it, and you should never become desensitized to hatred. As a human being, you should never become desensitized to it. And as a society, you absolutely should never get desensitized to it. I remember shortly after becoming First Minister of Scotland, and I was walking with my daughter, who was 4 at the time, she's 5 now, and somebody walked past me and they shouted white power. And it just obviously made me upset, because I was with my daughter. Now, she didn't understand, she was 4 years old, and I didn't have to explain it to her. But it also made me think that regardless of the fact that I had the top job in Scotland, the first thing that some people will see of me, it's not that I'm First Minister of Scotland, but that I'm a brown person, or that I'm a Muslim. And that will then, for them, create some negative connotations for far too many. And why has that happened? It's happened because over a number of decades, instead of confronting the far right, which is driven by anti-Muslim hatred, so many politicians across Europe have tried to appease them and tried to adopt that language now very firmly into the mainstream. Let's just take some examples in Europe. The National Front in France, their candidate for Prime Minister at the last election, Jordan Bardella, was associated with a movement that held wine and sausage parties in Muslim neighbourhoods. The AfD in Germany quite literally had a chapter in the manifesto that was titled "Islam Doesn't Belong to Germany." Geert Wilders, leading in the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, again, quite literally compared the Quran, Muslims' holy textbook, to Mein Kampf. And just in the UK general election, Nigel Farage, now an elected member, started his campaign by saying Muslims in Britain don't share British values, a dog whistle of the highest order. And what European politicians are not grasping is, if you try to appease and mainstream that, the signal you are sending to the rest of society is that Muslims don't belong here, they're a fifth column here, they don't share our values, and therefore they're fair game for when it comes to abuse, harassment, discrimination, and different treatment. And that is a failure that should shame all of us and will have deep, deep consequences.
Humza Yousaf, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure having you on Centre Stage.
Thank you. Shukran jazilan.